Good evening, everybody. I'm Jeanne Adams, and welcome to the panel room at ConTinual, the con that never ends. Tonight, we have some wonderful guests, and we're going to talk about critique groups and writing groups for writers of all kinds. So, without further ado, let my panelists introduce themselves. Nancy, let's start with you.
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write the Boar King's Honor historical fantasy trilogy for Falstaff Books, and I write various subgenres of romance. And with Jeannie, I write the Outcast Station science fiction mystery series. And I do not have one of those books behind me because I forgot. So sorry about that, but we do write that together. And I've been in a couple of critique groups.
Donna?
I'm Donna Gulick, currently working on Mystic in a Minivan, a nonfiction book. And I've been in a writing and critique group since '02, same ongoing group, although some members have moved away. We lost one last year to cancer. So we now and then need to invite a new person in. It has been remarkable in terms of keeping us all writing, but more than that, we all bring different gifts. So I'm pleased to contribute tonight.
Excellent. Darren?
Hi, I'm Darren Kennedy. I write paranormal thrillers and contemporary fantasy. I have my Fugue and Fable trilogy and my soon-to-be completed chess trilogy called The Pawn Stratagem. And I've been in several different critique groups, and we'll, I'm sure, get to those very soon.
Yes, indeed we will, because like right now, we'll get into that. So critique groups and writing groups can differ, but critique groups generally, you critique each other's work, whether a few pages or a chapter at a time. It can vary with the group, but they all have positive and negative things about them. So why don't we start with the positives, and we'll go in reverse order here. Darren, what are some of the really positive things for you that have come out of a critique group?
I would say, gosh, there's so many. The first I would say is you learn how to accept criticism because Lord knows for the rest of your writing career, somebody's going to have something to say about what you wrote or the way you wrote it or something. And so it's good to learn how to absorb that. And then to go a little bit further in that, when you're submitting stuff to be, read either novel length, short story length, or whatever, it's good to have people whose opinions about whether or not you're going to get paid for that story not be the first ones to go, you got 3 gems in that story. You're like, oh, that's right. So maybe I should cut out 2 of the gems or something. Let's see. I have made most of my friends. I moved to Charlotte in 2009, and the vast majority of my really close friends here in Charlotte and in the general Carolinas area, I've met through either critique groups or through cons. And a lot of that those groups all sort of like mishmash together. So it's helped me make my community. And I don't want to steal everybody else's answers because I could probably go on for half an hour. So I'll let everybody else talk for a minute.
Donna, what do you think have been some of the most positives? Obviously, your critique group has been a long-term sort of thing. So what do you think some of the positives over those years have been for your work?
I've really appreciated that each member brings a completely different set of skills. One's been out in the world writing in the world kind of critiques for world health, and another one's only written in sustained fiction as practically the theme of her life, and so on. And another one is phenomenal at noticing any place you were redundant, if your word even showed up twice. However, don't try, if you're a poet too, to have your poetry group and your critique group for fiction and creative nonfiction be the same. It doesn't work real well, especially if the others don't even read poetry. So the poetry I have to do in a different place, and the creative nonfiction in the group. Another real strength I appreciate is we always start with what we like about a person's piece, then we go into what we would change. And that, I find, then says to any insecure part of any of us, oh, it's okay. They liked things. This is what needs changing, in their opinion. Another thing I really appreciate is when you share, we've found anyway, your writings, fiction or nonfiction, you become closer and closer as people because you really get a different view of everybody than you would in a normal conversation. And I've so appreciated the community it creates.
I remember the very first time I was in a writing group with you was also the very first time I had shared my writing publicly. And I remember like it was yesterday that I had my laptop on my knees and my knees were shaking so badly that I could not read it because it was the first time I had read everything. And everybody was so positive. And so I would agree with you. I think that's one of the best things if you have a critique group that they say the positive things and they're like, okay, so it wasn't a complete failure. Nancy, what about you? What are some of the positives you've found?
Well, I agree with what Donna and Darren have said, but also I found in the critique groups I was in that people had enough different perspectives that everybody didn't always come at it from the same angle. And sometimes the angle somebody would come at it from, maybe just one person in the group would click and it's like, yeah, I can use that. So that was very, very helpful. And I'm very fond of starting sentences with gerund phrases. Now, if you have never been in a critique group with a grammar Nazi, you might not remember what that is. A gerund phrase is a verb that ends in ing, like getting to her feet, comma, she sighed. The getting to her feet is a gerund phrase because getting is a gerund. So, and so I learned this obviously in critique group, but one of the people in my group had a yellow highlighter and she would highlight every gerund phrase in yellow. And that makes you really conscious of how many times you've done that. When your manuscript comes back and it looks like somebody peed on it. And I really would not want, as Darren said, an editor to be the person who pointed this out to me. So right. That was very helpful as well. And then in the first group I was in, we had a rule that you were not allowed to say yes, but, because that's deflecting. And if you're deflecting and not listening, you're not going to get anything out of it. But what we could do is say, okay, this is what I was going for. How do you think I missed it? And what can I do to hit it? So then it would be a little impromptu brainstorming thing where 5 people are helping me work out where this missed the mark. And I really liked that sense of collaboration. And I liked that give and take. And, you know, so there again, something somebody says might spur the idea that gets you over the hump.
Yeah, yeah. I think that critique groups are particularly good for that perspective that you mentioned, because everybody does come at it from a different place. And one of the critiques groups I was in, we had people who we all wrote romance, but there were different subgenres of romance. Mm-hmm. And so while they had the basic structure of there has to be a happily ever after, et cetera, they were looking at it from a different perspective of maybe a historical or contemporary or science fantasy romance. And so sometimes you'd have those discussions that would end up going off the rails about, okay, this is more of a trope in science fiction. And so I really appreciate the yes, but, because we were not allowed to do that either, because it's defensive. And one of the things we all had to learn, as Darren, you mentioned, is to sort of check your defensiveness at the door and go, everybody's here to help me. None of these people, may not be true in the wider world, but none of these people are here to hurt my feelings. They're just trying to help me make it better. As long as your critique group functions that way, it works really well. Now, I've had some negative experiences. I don't know about you all, but what are some of the negative things that either made you leave a critique group or adjust, like talk to your members and say, you know, we need to do this differently? What are some things that if someone's out there trying to think about forming a critique group that you might want to avoid? Donna, why don't we start with you?
One of the things we discovered very early on to avoid is if someone made a comment about someone else's writing, the other people whose writing it was not could not, when it was their turn, go, oh, but I disagree with so-and-so because she this, and I disagree with that. And then it became a discussion of who agreed with what instead of something the author could use. So you're in the cage was the way we always put it, unless it is your turn to speak or you are the one presenting your work at that time. Another thing that something that made me leave a poetry critique group, and that's a little different than what you're talking about with fiction, I think. But when somebody just says, I have no idea what you were talking about in that poem, that obliterates everything, rather than saying, I didn't know what this phrase meant. I wasn't sure what the analogy was you were driving at. So to avoid sort of glittering generalities on the positive side, or to avoid just negative blanketing on the other side.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Glittering generalities. I like that. Darren, what about you? What have been some negatives that have either had you leave or have you adjust strategies or?
Without going into too much detail, the worst thing that ever happened. So I've been in several. First, there was this thing that we had that was called Charlotte Writers that I was a part of for a couple years. Then I ran for about 2.5 years, and then continued to participate in for another couple of years. And when I was running it, one thing I can tell you is that it took an awful lot of time. And so you have to make sure, as with all things that we do in our writing career, is that you have X amount of time, and you have to decide which amount of your time you're going to be spending with your butt in the chair, making your words appear on the screen, and how much of your time you're going to spend helping everybody else. Even though while you're helping everybody else and reading their stuff, you are learning and becoming a better writer. So it's hard to truly separate those two. But so one would be, it's kind of time consuming. But another thing I was going to say is, when I was running it, I actually had to make a rule. If you are submitting something to us that is autobiographical, you cannot present it as fiction and then start crying at the end when we don't like the choices that you made in your life. When you have presented this to us as a piece of fiction, and we're saying, well, we think the main character did this really stupid thing, and like, it was me. I'm like, you cannot do that. So I would say that is rule one. Autobiographical has that written across the top. I found it frustrating sometimes to be in long-term critique groups with people who I felt like the next time we would read something, the things that I had recommended were all the same things that were there the last week and the month before and the month before. And I'm like, if you're going to keep coming, and if it's not like, these are not things that are like my opinion, these are things that are like, I really think this could be better if this would be the case. And once we've established that that's a good way to move, don't submit any more stuff with that stuff still in there. And then I can start targeting or helping, or whatever you want, whatever verb you want to use there, a different thing. But I don't want to keep saying, you're still doing blah, you're
still starting with gerund phrases.
You're still starting with gerund phrases. Darren got really frustrated. So those are three right off the top of my head. And like I said, I can talk all night. So I would like to hear what Nancy has to say.
Well, that sounds like my cue. So I've actually had really good experiences in my critique groups. I haven't had a problem with that. The first group kind of drifted apart because people stopped writing as much and weren't as focused on publishing. And then the second group, I left because I wanted to move at a faster pace than the group tended to want to do, because as Darren says, we all have to manage our time.
Right.
So having said that, though, I have had critiques where somebody tried to rewrite my voice. They weren't really making the story any different. And it took me years to figure out what author voice was. You know, people would say that, and I mean, the definition of it's the way you assemble the words on the page is great, but it really doesn't tell me anything. So it took me a long time to figure out what that was. But I got a critique back where every paragraph had at least one sentence in it that had been rewritten.
Oh my
And
word.
I mean, the sentence was just rewritten. And I took it to my then critique group and said, okay, I'm still figuring out this voice stuff. But I think what happened is this person wrote my voice out and her voice in. And they looked at it and they went, that's exactly what happened. And they would tell me, because they would say, you know, I'm really sorry, but. So I know they would tell me if they had disagreed with that. And you have to watch out for that, because it will squelch the joy out of your story if you get that kind of, because it's not really helpful, because I'm never going to write it the way someone else would write it. I have to write it the way I write it. And that to me is one of the biggest problems with critiques. I got a lot of really helpful critiques from entering RWA contests for unpublished writers, but I also got some critiques like that. And I was an undergraduate history major, and I'm an Anglophile, and I've been reading English history since I was 9 years old. And I research the social era. Now, that's not to say I never get anything wrong, because of course I do from time to time. Try not to let it get into print, but occasionally I do get something wrong. And I've had critiques come back from these contests that said people were not embalmed in this period. And I just want to go, honey, I got the book here about it. You know, but you can't do that, because there's no mechanism for that, and you never win by doing that. It's better to just go, you know what, just because this person didn't understand this doesn't mean they didn't make some good points.
Right.
And I had one contest judge tell me, this was not a popular period in the market, let's say, but I liked it, so I wrote in it. And she said, readers do not understand this period, so you need to explain the history right up front so people know what's going on. And I looked at that and I thought, let's just take the pace out and beat it to death. Why don't we? It's just like, no. So I think it takes a certain level of confidence in your own ability and your own knowledge to go, this doesn't work for me. Right. And when I was first starting out, if it was a matter of the writing and not the matter of something like the history that I knew I had down cold, then I was much more likely to listen to things like, you need to explain the history up front. And I think it takes a certain amount of experience to take that kind of feedback. And honestly, if somebody's in a critique group where somebody did that all the time or rewrote their voice all the time, you should run, not walk, as far away as you can.
I think one of the biggest challenges with starting out with a critique group is you don't know some of these things, which is why I wanted to do the panel on it. The very first critique group I was in was when I was really starting out writing fiction. Now, I had been writing for years as in my corporate world, but I had secretly written fiction for years, but I had not worked to publish. And the cloak and dagger stuff, where you're secretly in the closet writing fiction. And the critique group insisted that you write a chapter and you send that out one week, and then you were to write the next chapter for the next week. And first of all, as a new writer, that was not a pace I felt comfortable with. And second of all, but I didn't know how to say that. And second of all, I would get this, the yellow highlighter kind of the thing on the first chapter, and I would be so baffled by that and realize and make all these changes that everybody suggested, because they were certainly not shrinking violets about suggesting things. So that by the time I started trying to write the second chapter in a blazing hurry to get it ready to send it out, it was not my book any longer. And so now, any one of you who've heard me on panels or taken classes with me or anything, is my first soapbox comment in every class I teach is, there's only one way to write a book, and that's your way. But the thing the critique group taught me was that there are a lot of ways to write a book, and that everybody's way is a little different, and you try things that other people suggest. And if it doesn't work for you, you move on. But some of the problems with critique groups is sometimes they have some very rigid rules, and you as a writer have to decide, can I work with that? Is that going to actually be good for me and spur me on? Or is it going to be something that shuts me down? And the changing of voice thing, I've had that in several groups, and I'm like, yeah, no, that won't work for me.
I've had that too.
Yeah.
Speak to something both you and Nancy said. And this was one of my big rules for myself, but also that I would, especially when I was running the group, I would always sort of say before we got started, is that when you're getting a critique and someone shows you something, a story is a road. And when someone highlights something, they're showing you where for them, there was a speed bump. And your job as the writer is to do one of three things: to either disagree and leave it the way it is, change it in sort of the way they recommend, or what I often found was the most useful thing was C, which was to make something better than you or they came up with. Because what you're really trying to do is get to the part of the story where everybody in your critique group, they have like 2 full pages of yours that they've not highlighted. That's where they just went brrr and read right through. And that was, and so you want to, streamline or whatever your speed bumps with whatever works for you as the writer. But all they've done is put a spotlight on a speed bump, and your decision is whether or not which of those 3 things you're going to do with it.
That's a great way to look at it, because that takes it away from the personal. And I think that's one of the hardest things about critiques of any kind, whether it's from a group or whether it's from an editor, is not taking it personally.
Right.
Well, and I think it helps if the people in the group don't say, you did this. They say, in this scene here, I had a problem here because, and that makes it feel less personal.
Right.
But if that's not somebody's natural approach to things, it can take them a while to slip into that. And there is a tendency to say, this thing you wrote right here. And that gets a lot of people's defenses up when somebody says that.
But I think that goes back to what Donna was saying about sometimes that's the knowledge base in your group. If you've got a wide range of people, like Nancy, I know you and I have talked before about writing with romance authors, or having a romance author read your work who's not familiar with some of the tropes that are used in science fiction and fantasy, where anybody who's got that background or reads that sort of thing is going to understand those tropes immediately. And so they say in the critique, like you said, Darren, they'll be like on that going, this is a speed bump and this is awful, you can't do this. And you're like, but every reader who reads paranormals is going to get that from the get-go. So sometimes it's great to have the perspective, but sometimes you need somebody who has a little understanding of the tropes in the genre too.
Got to imagine that at one point someone told George Lucas, flashlights don't really bounce off each other. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Probably.
Well, and I'm sure that we've all had the experience, like Nancy talked about, of having some piece of information that absolutely is correct because you've researched it either ad nauseum or you've got a stack of books from the library or whatever, and have someone say, that's not right. Or having, I had a critique once that said, the writing here is good, but sports stories don't sell.
That's not helpful.
So not helpful. And, at that point, sports stories were starting to really sell. And so it didn't really matter. But have you had the experience, Darren, for instance, of having something a critique did stop you in your tracks and make you rethink the entire story? Or have you not had that?
Can I go second? I want to think about
it. Yes, absolutely. What about you, Donna?
I'm going to throw it on somebody else. Haha.
Pass that ball.
I haven't had it stop me. I have had where, for example, one of the members of our group who was very good at seeing the big picture of things was saying, You're not, is an autobiographical. It's a type of memoir. It's a teaching memoir. And so she was saying, there's places you're really not strolling us through. You're just assuming, okay, they got it, and kept going. And she said it about a huge portion of the book, which is 2/3 to 3/4 written, if you don't count that I keep rewriting. And it was a real pause, because it meant going back through every chapter and saying, if the person had never heard of who I am, what I do, or anything like it, what else would they need to know? And I found that very difficult at first. On the other hand, it didn't stop me from writing, just gave me so much more work to do.
What about you, Nancy?
I've never had that experience, I'm happy to say. I have had critiques like we need to explain the history up front so people understand what's going on, that just kind of made my head explode for a couple of days because it's just so frustrating. But even those critiques, if you read through, what she was really saying is, I don't have the background to understand this from the get-go. I did, because I'd read 3 books on the period. But that's a hint that you can drop little things in. You don't have to do an info dump on the first page. You can drop in a little fact here and a little fact there so that the reader understands what's going on in the scene. So they have what's important in this scene. And then you can work the rest of it in lulls. So she was making a valid point. She just made it in a way that was not helpful, shall we say.
And I think so often that's the case, is that if you can step back from the personal nature of a critique and say, Nancy and I both were in RWA and would do these contests, and you would usually have 4 to 5 judges. And I learned finally that if you could step back and look at the 5 critiques for what's the theme, what's the thing that every single one of those 5 judges said, this is a great story, but your hero troubles me. Your hero has some problems here, but I like the story overall. If everyone has something about the hero, you may need to look at your hero, right? But I also learned that the nature of some of them, sports stories don't sell, is very idiosyncratic. And so if somebody doesn't like that period or your genre, or, sometimes the critique can be unhelpful in the main. But so Darren, did you come up with anything?
I really can't think of it. The only person that usually makes me have to back up and punt is me. Whenever I was writing this one many, many years ago, and I realized it didn't need to be 3rd person past tense, but 1st person present tense. And I had named the main character the wrong name. So I basically scrapped it and start over. Or in this one where I'm writing now, where I buried the person twice. And so I have to, I don't think you really get 2 funerals. And the first one was really good. So that whole section had to be that. I literally just finished that this week, but I am my own worst critic. I'm always like, you can't do that. So I have stopped myself in my tracks before, but that's about it.
Well, Darren actually made me change something one time.
Uh-oh.
What'd I do?
We were talking about this story, and I don't want to be specific because the book's coming out later this year and I don't want to spoil it. But there was an artifact that was important, and the hero and the heroine were on a quest for the artifact. And I'd figured out how they were going to find it. And Darren and I were on our way to a con, and I was telling him about it. And he said, okay, when do they use it? And I'm like, excuse me? And he said, when do they use it? Like the gun in Act 1 that has to go off by Act 3. And I went, oh. And then when I stopped and thought about that, it was like, yeah. But I was so fixated on the history around this thing that it had the old rule about if there's a gun in Act 1, for those who are not watching and are not familiar with it, it has to go off by Act 3. And I just thought, oh, I just love this artifact. It's so cool. It's so full of history, yada, yada, yada. And I was going on my merry little geek way. And Darren said, and so it was really a big help.
I think Nancy was going to have Obi-Wan show Luke the lightsaber in Act 1, and we were going to get no lightsaber fight in the entire movie. I was like, this cannot happen. It's a cool artifact too, so it needed to be.
Well, thank you.
It needed to be used for sure.
Yeah, I had a critique once, and part of the reason I asked the question was I had a critique once that it was so damning that I was like, well, Lord, I'm just a terrible writer, and I have no common sense, and obviously I don't know what I'm doing. And so I put the story away, and I thought, well, guess, I can't do this. And the person who had written the critique contacted me and said, I just reread this, and I read something that I completely missed in the first read. So you have these 2 paragraphs on page 3 that explain everything that I said was wrong with the story. But I didn't go back and read it. Once I got that critique, I was just like, oh my gosh, well, I just have to put this away, because obviously the idea for the story is not going to work. The artifact is important, but I didn't use it. So I got to put this away. And so I went back after she said that and read it and went, yeah, that really is in there. So I think sometimes you have to take a critique with a grain of salt, or sometimes you have to reread with the idea of, like you said, Donna, did I assume too much knowledge? Or did I assume that people understood a trope and didn't explain it? And to me, that's one of the greatest values of a critique, is to say, now I did get a review rather than a critique one time that said, of a book of mine that said, well, you never explained this thing. There's an art heist, and you say, you never explained where the art went. And I'm like, pretty sure I did.
Yeah, you did. Right.
So you go back and you go, yeah, I did. You just missed it.
Another rule of our critique group was sort of one of my internal rules is never assume that everybody else carefully read your story as carefully as you read theirs. Never,
Yes.
especially when there's
Exactly.
like, you didn't have a lightsaber fight at the end. You're like, you didn't see the lightsaber fight at the end. It was awesome.
Well, on page 357, there's a lightsaber fight.
Right.
That right there says, oh, the paper doesn't show up. That's kind of cool. My thing
That
was,
is a lightsaber fight.
yes.
Nancy and I happen to be in not a critique group together, but a plotting group together. And so we actually start before the story starts. So Nancy, why don't you talk a little bit about our plotting group?
It's really kind of a masochistic exercise in writing work, because back when life was normal, we would go hole up in a Suites hotel for a 3-day weekend, or sometimes 4 days.
Ooh, fun.
And we would take food and we would emerge for dinner,
There would be
very rarely
snacks.
for lunch. Jeannie would get up and cook eggs. I mean, I'd be shoveling cold cereal in and I'd be fine with that. But Jeannie's like, I'm going to make eggs. And says, well, so you're going to make eggs, I'll eat them. But we would start about 10 o'clock in the morning and plot the first book. And we work on it until it was done. And then we plot a book for the next person. And the goal was to plot 2 books per person for the 4 of us. And so it's pretty intense. And we started with characters. And once you get the character, you go into the plot. And I was having trouble with a plot recently. It just wouldn't click. I just try to push at it and poke at it, and it just didn't fall. And Jeannie said, did you think about the characters? And I said, well, they're right here on the page. And she said, no, did you think about the characters? And so even though this was a really pressured time, we had a lot of fun with it and got to know each other a lot better. Like Donna was saying about her critique group, learned that we could be holed up in a Suites hotel for 4 days and not kill each other, which is
very important. Very important.
consumed a fair amount of wine.
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, that's the basics. Do you want to embroider on that, Jeannie?
Oh, well, yeah, I always like to embroider and I'm a storyteller. Well, one of the things that's great about a plotting group versus a critique group is that you can find some of those story holes before you're at the 85% mark of your novel. I am notorious, or have been, I'm not anymore, but I was notorious for writing myself into a corner. I'd get myself to the 85% mark and not know how to make the rest, last 15% go. And the reason I don't do that anymore is because the other 3 ladies in our group, sometimes 4, but it's pretty settled into 3 for quite a while now, would say to me, no, you actually have to know the ending. You know, we're not going to let you get away with this. You need to know how the story ends, because otherwise you're going to get stuck at the 85% mark again. I'd be, no, I'm good. And they're like, no, you're not. So we got to know each other well enough that we could say that sort of thing to each other. But we also got, one of the things that that helped me so much is that it was so much easier to write forward and write steadily from beginning through middle and all the way to the end, because I had done that work with them. We would plot things out and we would hit the high points and do character studies if we needed them. And sometimes we would come to the plotting group with, I know who the hero is and I know what they look like and I know what their job is, but I don't know anything else about them. I know what the story starts with, because that was me, because I almost always know how the story starts. Every now and again, I know how the story ends. Those are really unusual to plot. But in some ways, a plotting group works better for me than a critique group does, because for me, a critique group, I realized that I had to know the whole story, and in some cases, write the whole story before I could have it critiqued and find the plot holes. Because somebody critiquing it would change how I wrote the story. So for me, the plotting group actually has worked better than a critique group. So with that, saying that, the various kinds of critique groups, Darin, the one you're in now, how do you do it? Do you send just the beginning through? Do you send pages through? How do you work that?
I'm not currently in one, and it's not really a pandemic sort of thing, but the ones that I've been in, Charlotte Writers was a very large group where we would sometimes have 20 people gather at the library. And so basically everybody would have to submit we would pick 2 people this month, and then the next month they would get to go. And so with 2 weeks to spare, they would send me, the person in charge, their stories, and then I would send it out as quickly as I could to everybody who said they were going to come, or put it available on the website so everybody could download it. And then basically everybody had to have a week to get it done. And then they would show up, and it was sort of more of like a round table discussion versus my smaller groups. A lot of times it would be, you would turn your stuff in and then people would actually send you back Microsoft Word with track changes so that you would have more of a physical document. So one of mine was more of a, let's have a bit, and in the large group, I think it worked better. I don't think I would want to get 20 different track changes documents to work on. That would make me want to leap from a tall building. And so, yeah. but having 20 people sort of go, the 3 things that didn't work for me are this, this, and this, and really getting a very broad thing. That's almost like getting a nice large panel of readers to help you, but in more of a small, like more what you actually think of as a critique group. I found the Microsoft Word stuff, very specific things to work on, more helpful. So those are the 2 main types I've been in.
Donna, what about you? How does your critique group work?
Well, I would actually like an additional version for what we're doing. What we've been doing is, because there are only 5 of us and we've kept it to 5 all the way through. Therefore, everyone who's written, which used to be everybody, at this point we've got one not writing, but would get to read. But what they would do is read, if all went well, had a manuscript with them that people could then look over, and they would be reading one chapter usually. Or if their chapter happened to be very long, maybe a couple scenes out of a chapter. Some people auditorily will be like it was all on page 32 and 33, but they completely missed it. They're like, but I wish you'd told me. Yeah, I did. So it would work better if everybody was organized enough to send what they're going to read ahead of time, so people could at least have read it. They could do the yellow later even. But the combo of the auditory and then they're trying to look over it with 5 minutes is not quite thorough enough. Now we have 2 or 3 members that will say, send me the manuscript and I'll work on it. The trick is then whether they're leaving your voice in.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges about critique, period, is when you're a brand new writer, learning to develop voice without losing it to critique.
Right.
And then even later, when you have a solid confidence in your voice, still the challenge can be someone trying to write your voice out. Right.
Or if they're trying to make it more concise, that's okay, but they've got to leave the voice in. And that's where the glitch comes in. It's like, okay, that's really concise. Now, it doesn't sound anything like my conversational tone that is my voice.
Right. Right.
So it's putting, and yet there are definite places where, yes, that should have been one phrase, not 2 sentences.
Right. Nancy, what about you?
Well, I've actually been in 3 critique groups. I blanked on the first one, but the first 2 that I was in were in-person groups. The first group, we tried to bring things to the meeting to pass out for next time. And there were only 5 of us initially and 6 of us in the end. So that wasn't laborious. We weren't, printing off the equivalent of a manuscript to hand to people. Or to send it out at least 2 weeks ahead of time, so people would have time to read it. And it was 1 chapter at a time. And then the second group was 20 pages. And we were supposed to send it out a week ahead of time or bring it. And then I'm in an online group, and it's very unregimented. When somebody needs something, they say, I've got this, who has time to read it? And I need comments back by this date. And so it's a lot more loosey-goosey because we don't meet as such. So it was good for me to have to sit down and write something and have it ready for the next week.
Right, right. It keeps you sort of on track for writing, keeps your butt in the chair.
Yeah, and I'm not an auditory learner.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, I can pick up things more easily in somebody's material if I'm actually reading it. And so I've never been in a group where you read to the group. I'm not sure that I would be a good fit for a group like that.
I don't think you'd even like a group like that unless they were giving you the manuscript ahead of time. And then you just listened as if you were at a bookstore hearing somebody read. Yeah, Darren.
Yeah, Darren.
When we had our big group, even though we had sent everything out ahead of time, we usually had the person read 1 to 3 paragraphs for a couple minutes just to hear them read. But it was more like what Nancy said, the actual reading with the eyes was what was going to get critiqued. But we sort of did a mishmash of that, I think.
And I wanted to pick up on something that Donna said when she said she didn't think I would like a group like that. She's right, I wouldn't. And that's something that people sometimes don't think about because they're so desperate to get in a critique group because they don't know anybody. And here's a critique group and here's writers and they're going to talk about my story with me. And when you've been out there writing all by yourself and wishing somebody would tell you something, that's like gold.
Yeah.
But the problem is you all might not be a good fit.
Right.
And the group that I was in originally formed with 5 of us. And 2 of us had known each other for a long time. We met a third one in a writing class at one of the local colleges. And then we invited a couple of other people we knew. But the very first meeting, when we sat down, we said, this has to be no harm, no foul. If this doesn't work for anybody, she's free to walk. If it doesn't work for any of us, we say, well, we tried it. And I think it's hard to do that sometimes when you've been really, really desperate for somebody to give you some feedback who is not your mother or your best friend who's going to love it because they love you. And I think any critique group, you have to go into it with everybody understanding that if it doesn't work, you're going to walk. I mean, my second critique group, I was recommended to it by a friend who was leaving the group. And I had feedback for romance, but I wanted people who read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, and that's what this group was. And so the agreement was that I would come to a meeting and participate in one session. People sent me their stuff, I sent them my stuff, and we'd do a meeting. And then I could walk away and they could say no, and nobody was going to take it personally. And I really think it's important to set that up front when you're trying that. Because my first critique group, when we went to take in another person, we all went to lunch with her just to talk to her about writing and how she approached it. And then we did the same thing. Let's do a session and see how it works. And she was a great fit, and it was wonderful that she joined us. But she said, you know, I kind of feel like I've been to sorority rush. It's like, but you know, this is your writing. This is a piece of you.
Right.
And it's really important not to have people poking at it who don't get it.
Right.
It's really important.
But it's also important to have people who will be honest and not, as you say, like your mom or your best friend, whitewash things that are wrong with it.
Oh, totally.
And one of the things I think that for our viewers, if you're thinking about critique groups, is to find people who are writing at your level or slightly better than you, or maybe even a lot better than you. But if there's too much disparity between very beginning writers and very experienced writers, a critique group can be brutally frustrating because the experienced writer is not going to get anything from the critique of the novice writer, because the novice writer doesn't know enough yet, other than to be a reader and say, I liked the story, or I didn't like this aspect of the story. But that's not immediately helpful in a critique group. And the experienced writer is going to be super frustrated, like you talked about earlier, Darren, is if the novice writer refuses to stop using gerund phrases or stop using, you know, comma splices. My absolute Nancy will sometimes read me, she's like, oh God, the comma splices. I do learn though. I do learn. I can be trained. I am better at it. But if you're too far apart in your skill level, a critique group can be brutal. I think one of the biggest things that all of us have said is that you have to be unafraid to walk away. And so anybody else have anything they'd like to say that we didn't cover about critique groups? Donna?
Let me think a second. I'll pass while someone else comes up.
Anybody have something they'd like to say about critique groups?
I've been really fortunate with critique groups. My online critique group, I met in AC Crispin's Advanced Writers Workshop at DragonCon. And they had been in the workshop the year before that and had formed this group and were kind enough to let me join it after I met several of them the next year. And it turned out to be a good fit, and they were already friends and I've become friends with them. And I think a good critique group is literally worth its weight in gold. A terrible critique group, you really should run like a bunny to get away from that. It's just, and I think it should be set up, like I said earlier, that if this isn't working out, it's no harm, no foul. None of us take it personally. I just think that's so important, like you said, to be willing to walk away.
It is. I think another thing is setting additional boundaries when needed. If you have an author where, like in Darren's, you had a certain number of pages that they were to submit, or a chapter. But if you have an author who writes exceptionally long chapters and who thinks, well, here's my chapter and it's going to take the entire meeting or your week to edit it, then an additional boundary that wasn't named at the beginning needs to be named, because that's the thing that keeps them going, or they crash is when either one person dominates or someone is so subdominant that they get swallowed almost by other people. Bringing those boundaries that create the structure that keeps it going is as important as the tone with which people come to it.
We never at Charlotte Writers had a word count, and I kept saying we should probably have a word count because people get longer and longer. And then one week somebody submitted 35,000 words with the expectation that it was going to get like critiqued in the space of like
Holy cow.
10 days. And I just said 7. And so we established 5,000 words. I will read 5,000 words of anybody's stuff. You know, if you're like, Darren, I want you to read my story. How long is it? 5,000 words. Done. Just send it to me. I'll critique it. I'll Microsoft Word, mark it up, and I'll send it right back to you. And I've done it. But I was not going to sit. I mean, that's like a third of a pretty decent sized novel. I was like, it's fine. But I mean, are you going to read 35,000 of mine and help me? So,
Right.
So I remember that. But what I was going to say is the big thing is never forget that when you're reading everybody else's stuff, you're learning just as much as you do
Right.
whenever they are reading your stuff, because you can learn really good things that you want to incorporate into your writing and really things that you do not want to incorporate in your writing. And most importantly, why does that person keep doing that all the time? That's horrible. And why do I do that too? Because you can see it in somebody else's work. And then the next time you look in your work, you're like, holy cow, I do the exact same thing that I was just fussing about that person doing. I do the same thing. And so you learn a lot. And so I find that both directions of the critique help you become a better writer. And I think being in a critique group is what's helped me get as far as I've gotten so far.
I agree completely.
So those are some of the positives and negatives of critique groups and plotting groups and writing groups in general. For those of you out there in our audience, we're about at time. So I'm going to have each of our panelists tell you how they can be found on the web and go from there. So Darren, why don't we start with you since we ended with you there?
Before we go, I just want to know, when you start a plotting group, does everybody have to do the Mr. Burns thing? But for you, when you have a plotting group, because that just seems like that would be something you would have to do.
No. We all wear fake mustaches and twirl the ends.
Ooh, yeah, you could do the twirly mustache too. That would be awesome. So yeah. I'm Darren Kennedy. I'm at DarinKennedy.com. It's pretty hard to remember. And look me up on Amazon or Facebook or Instagram or wherever. I'm kind of all over the place, and come find me. Love to chat with you.
Donna?
I'm Donna. You can find me at Donna Spring. That's like the season it's about to be, but it was also my maiden name, Gulick, GULICK.com.
Great. Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott. You can find me at nancynorthcott.com. And you can also find me on Twitter, where I spend probably a lot more time than is good for me. And I'm at Nancy Northcott on Twitter.
And I'm Jeanne Adams, and you can find me at jeanneadams.com and on most digital platforms. And like Nancy, I spend way too much time on Twitter. And you can find all of us here on ConTinual. All of us have done several panels here, so you can find us on ConTinual on Facebook and on YouTube and occasionally on Twitch. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye.
You, everybody.